All right, everyone, it's time to talk about a little bit more of a philosophical concept here. I'm getting more, I guess, into that because sometimes politics you experience a little bit of burnout. There's only so many polls you can analyze and so many political figures that you can talk about. At some point, you're going to turn into a broken record. So it'll break things up a little more. I'll do an occult video later as well on an interesting topic that I was thinking about actually the other day when I was just walking to the store. This is how I get inspiration. When I'm like out walking, I sit there and daydream. I don't even pay attention when I'm crossing the street half the time and just start randomly daydreaming about weird shit. And sometimes it gives me video ideas and sometimes they pan out. But I was thinking, postmodernism suggests at its core that beauty is ugliness and ugliness is beauty. Or at the very least that there's some sort of abstract begging of the question, what is beauty, what is strength, what is nobility? And that amorphous sort of malleability allows you to sort of analyze things from different perspectives. Partially this makes sense. Partially it's just a mental exercise. Insofar as you're talking about the intellectual pursuit of simply analyzing art, analyzing music, and so forth, I think that's positive. Being able to think in new ways is inherently, I think, a good thing. Because some people, they're very rigid in the way they think, and it's not so much that I would suggest people alter their way of thinking. It's just they have to be able to think as though they were altering it. So, for instance, you would think about it's sort of like putting yourself in another person's shoes. It doesn't mean that their particular perspective is correct. It doesn't mean that their perspective or the things they believe or the things that they're doing is right or noble or positive in any way. But you can understand at least where they're coming from. An inability to understand that shows a mental rigidity which is excessive, I believe. That being said, when we're talking about what is beautiful, what is strong, and so forth, these things are not really abstract terms at all. They're relatively concrete. The concept, like let's say we're making statues and I'm trying to make a statue to personify strength. If I'm not making it more abstract in the brutalist fashion, like big and blocky, like a fucking Mussolini sculpture or something, it's probably going to resemble like classical art. It's going to be someone who's fit and what we would consider aesthetic in the sense of physical health. Like an Olympian statue or something. That would be how you would display that. The idea that a piece of canvas with random lines of paint drawn across it actually represents that, you can sort of make that argument, but here's what I've thought when we look at postmodern art in the explicit sense, for example. What we're seeing are essentially people that are Dadaists without the honesty. That's what I consider postmodern art to be. Now, there are some postmodern art forms that I consider pleasing. I consider, and I don't know if this would fit in more with postmodernism or just modernism, pointillism I find aesthetically pleasing. Abstract shapes and figures can be interesting, they can be thought-provoking, but it's sort of an inauthentic thought process. It really doesn't represent anything at all when you think about it. That three pink lines and a blue square and stuff doesn't really represent anything. What it invites is for people to overlap their own meaning onto it. Generally speaking, there's no real way to do that in any objective sense. It lacks a concrete value or virtue to itself. It has no actual form or function. It's essentially like the Sound and the Fury. What it is like the Dadaists. You may have heard of that particular art group. We're talking about a century ago, the Dadaists. Essentially, their art form was absurdism. The idea, and they were very forthcoming about this, more or less, was that it didn't represent anything. That it was anti-art after a fashion. It's sort of like if you were to make a musical concept album and it's just a bunch of random noises and you're laughing at your own audience. And some people have done this. It doesn't actually represent anything. The only thing you can say that it represents is anti-representation. That would be an honest appraisal of it. The postmodernist does the same thing, but then simply says, oh yes, it has a meaning. Dig deep within yourself to find the inner meaning. Well, that's hippie-trippy bullshit. What it is that a bunch of talentless grifters have decided, hey, if art can be 3 lines on a canvas, if art can be I blasted, shit out of my asshole at a bucket and I put it on display and this represents Queen Mary or something, they've realized that it doesn't actually take any talent. All you have to do is be very whimsical, eccentric, and abstract, and say that it represents something, but you're not going to impose upon the audience by suggesting anything central, and you're allowed to make up your own interpretation. All it is Dadaism minus the honesty. The Dadaist would tell you that when they wear a cardboard box and you know, poke you with a flute, it doesn't represent anything. It's anti-art. It's a performance art insofar as it's not art at all. It's a mockery of what then would have counted as postmodernism. It's a mockery of anarchist art. It's a mockery of postmodern convention. It's a mockery of the post-Art Nouveau period that goes from, you know, absinthe-inspired fairies and squiggly lines to the very brutal Art Deco period, and then sort of goes weird beyond that. It's essentially a lashing back at that nonconformist aspect. It's essentially a laugh at the expense of people that really are laughing all the way to the bank. The postmodernist doesn't do that. The postmodernist says that the Venus figurine reimagined as some sort of cultural tribal trope, and you have to appreciate it or you're racist or something. Well, no, you don't really have to. There's a progression within art towards the aesthetic, the realistic, the expressive in a more authentic, concrete sense, and then you have degeneration. Degeneration away from those primary sort of goals. To represent something as it really is, the hyper-realistic. To represent something idealized, to represent as you wish it would be, whether in a realistic sense or sub-realistic. And the fantastical and thought-provoking that has sort of a symbolic or central essence. These are the goals of art, of true expressive art. The only proper thing outside of that is a mockery thereof, or a mockery of people who in turn are mocking those main art forms. Again, the realistic, the aesthetically enhanced, and the fantastical and thought-provoking, the intellectual, you could call it. Because, of course, you have types of art. For instance, a lot of the religious art throughout history, it's not necessarily fully realistic. It certainly doesn't depict something that's real in the mundane sense, like a buffalo or a human form that's realistic. It represents a spiritual trope. It represents you know, you have a landscape and it's got like angels and devils and weird shit in it, like Hieronymus Bosch or something like that. It's not hyper-realistic in the general sense, and not even physically realistic insofar as in that era things tended to be a little bit unrealistic anyway. Close, but it's not exactly photographic reality. It's intellectual and thought-provoking, though, and that fits it in there. What I would say, though, is that postmodernism seeks to cause the world to worship ugliness. It seeks to remove the actual authentic aesthetic form in the idealized or the realistic sense. And it's not really intellectual at all. The only intellectual statements that can be made about it are to mock it, essentially, as a Dadaist. But they would have so much fun with the true postmodernism, a la, you know, some of the art you get basically the 80s on, the weird colors that you get in the 80s, and again, squiggly lines and stuff. And that can be decorative, especially in a pattern sense. It can be utilitarian. But it can't really be truly aesthetic in the same sense as classical art now, can it? It's not exactly Michelangelo. We got to be willing to admit that at some point, postmodern art isn't really art at all, and that the people making it are just being dishonest, and that they're just trying to hide behind political convention. That the least conformist, supposedly, people are actually the ones that seek to make you conform to whatever political established reality currently exists in order to shield themselves from criticism. It's very interesting how that happens. That's about all. Peace out.